It's the moment where the immovable object meets the unstoppable force. On one side, you have the grandfather of gonzo documentary making, the man who stared down neo-Nazis and the Westboro Baptist Church with nothing but a raised eyebrow and a polite question. On the other, you have an internet subculture that prides itself on being immune to shame, obsessed with dominance, and surgically calibrated to monetize outrage. When Netflix announced Louis Theroux was finally going to tackle the manosphere, it felt inevitable, like the final boss fight of his career. But now that Inside the Manosphere has been out for 10 days, the reaction isn't the victory lap people expected. It's messy, it's uncomfortable, and it raises a question Louis has been dodging since 2022. Can you effectively deconstruct a troll who is already filming you back? Today, we're dissecting Theroux's latest deep dive into the world of Andrew Tate acolytes, alpha podcasters, and the economy of male insecurity.
It is fascinating, isn't it? Because in many ways, this feels like the sequel to his 2022 BBC series, Forbidden America. Back then, in the episode Extreme and Online, he was looking at the alt-right, people like Nick Fuentes and Baked Alaska. That was political. It was about white nationalism wrapped in irony. But this new Netflix film, this is different. This isn't about voting blocks or heritage anymore. It's about money. It's about the grift.
That's the distinct shift. In Forbidden America, he was dealing with ideologues. You look at Nick Fuentes in that basement, which Louis narrates with that beautiful dry condescension, noting he live streams from his parents' basement. And Fuentes is trying to sell a vision of a white ethno-state. It's hateful, but it's a political project. In Inside the Manosphere, he's with Harrison Sullivan, HSTKKY TikToky, and Myron Gaines from the Fresh and Fit podcast. And you realize very quickly, they aren't trying to build a nation. They're trying to build a sales funnel.
Completely. There is a scene early in the new documentary that perfectly captures this. Louis is with Harrison Sullivan, this British fitness influencer who has exploded on TikTok. And Sullivan is just blatantly telling him, "I'm a salesman." He admits the controversy is the engine for the cash. He's driving traffic to financial apps and OnlyFans agencies, which is the ultimate irony given how much these guys claim to despise OnlyFans models. He's monetizing the very thing he tells his followers to hate.
That hypocrisy is central to the film, but I wonder if Louis actually nails it or if he just lets it slide too often. There's that moment with Myron Gaines where they're discussing one-way monogamy. Gaines is selling this idea that high-value men deserve to cheat while women must remain loyal. It's this pseudo-biological argument about kings and conquests. And Louis does his classic thing. He plays the befuddled Brit. He asks, but isn't that a bit unfair?
I think you're being a bit harsh on the method. Though I see your point, the power dynamic has definitely shifted. You saw this start in Forbidden America with the streamer Baked Alaska. There was that standoff where Baked Alaska, real name Anthime Giannet, literally pulls out his phone and starts streaming Louis. He says, "I'm making a documentary about you." It was this meta moment where the observer became the observed. Louis looked genuinely rattled in 2022. In the new Netflix doc, the subjects are even more media savvy. They know the edit is coming, but Louis still manages to get those slips of the mask. Look at the scene with Sullivan's mother. That was the most devastating part of the whole film for me. You have this young, pumped-up influencer bragging about his wealth, and then his own mother looks at Louis and basically asks, "If you don't agree with what Harrison is doing, why are you making money off him by publicizing it?"
That was a fourth wall break that I don't think Louis was ready for. It cuts to the core of the criticism he's faced since the Jimmy Savile days, but specifically regarding these modern extremists. The Guardian review of Forbidden America back in 2022 made a similar point that by engaging with trolls like Fuentes, you were giving them the oxygen they need to survive. Now, with Inside the Manosphere, Louis is on Netflix, a global platform, showcasing guys like Sneeko and Justin Waller to millions of people who might never have heard of them. There's a 14-year-old boy watching this right now who doesn't see the irony. He doesn't see Louis's raised eyebrow. He just sees Harrison Sullivan driving a McLaren and thinks, "I want that."
But is the alternative to just ignore them? These guys already have the audience. Sullivan has 500,000 people in a Telegram group. Nick Fuentes, despite being banned from almost everything, still commands a massive following. Louis' argument, which he made when promoting Forbidden America, is that these people exist whether the BBC or Netflix films them or not. Ignoring them doesn't make the tumor go away, it just lets it grow in the dark. What Louis does, and I think he does it better than anyone else, even now, is expose the hollowness behind the bravado. There's a moment in the new film where he's at the gym with Sullivan. Sullivan is posturing, doing his alpha male routine, and Louis just points at his legs and says, "Calves need a little work."
It was a good line.
It was lethal because it pricked the balloon. For a split second, you saw the insecurity flash across Sullivan's face. That is the service Louis provides. He reveals that these alpha kings are actually deeply insecure, often lonely men who are performing masculinity because they're terrified of being ordinary. The documentary makes them look, well, it makes them look like clowns.
See, I agree they look like clowns to us, to you and me, but I worry about the interpretation gap. Let's talk about the darker undercurrent that connects the 2022 doc to this 2026 one. Anti-Semitism. It's the glue that seems to bind the manosphere to the alt-right. In Forbidden America, Fuentes is openly a white nationalist. He jokes about the Holocaust. It's explicit. In Inside the Manosphere, it's more insidious. There's that segment with Sneeko and Gaines where they start talking about the Matrix. Initially, it sounds like they're just talking about escaping the 9-to-5 grind, borrowing that terminology from the movie. But then Lewis pushes a little on their pseudoscience, this insane idea that women retain DNA from every man they've slept with.
That was baffling. It's biologically impossible, but they state it as absolute fact to shame women.
Right, and when Louis pushes back, what happens? The chat room floods with comments calling Louis a Jew. Sneeko starts ranting about the Rothschilds. The mask falls off. It turns out the Matrix isn't just capitalism, it's a dog whistle for an old-school Jewish conspiracy theory. I think that was the most valuable moment of the documentary because it proved that the manosphere isn't just about men's rights or fitness. It's a gateway drug to the far right.
It's the pipeline. You start with Get Fit, move to Women Are Controlling You, and end up at The Jews Run the World. Louis exposed that link very clearly, and I think that's why the criticism that he's platforming them is slightly misplaced. If he hadn't pushed back in that room, we wouldn't have seen the anti-Semitism bubble up so quickly. We would have just seen the fitness influencer persona.
But I do want to touch on the clown aspect again versus the danger. In Forbidden America, there's a scene with Beardson Beardley. He's this hipster-looking guy, wears a Louis Theroux t-shirt to the interview, trying to be meta. Then when Louis asks him about doing a Nazi salute, Beardson throws him out of the house. It's funny in a pathetic way, but then you remember this guy threatened to rape a female streamer, Brittany Venti. The documentary toggles between look at these losers and these losers are dangerous.
That is the tension. And I'm not sure Inside the Manosphere balances it as well as his older work. In the new doc, the danger feels more abstract. We don't see the victims of the financial scams. We don't see the women who are harassed by the fresh and fit audience. We just see the perpetrators in their Miami penthouses. It felt sterile. It felt like lifestyles of the rich and toxic. There was a review in The Standard that called the production process stressful for Louis, and you can tell. He seems tired. In the interviews promoting the film, he mentioned how these guys have hundreds of thousands of tender young ears listening to them. I think he feels the weight of that, but I also feel like his toolkit, the silence, the faux naivety, is struggling against an opponent that has no shame. You can't shame Myron Gaines. He thrives on conflict. He wants Louis to look prickly, which is exactly what some of the reviews noted.
I think the prickly comment came from an interview Louis did about the documentary, where he seemed annoyed that the journalist was questioning his methods. And honestly, I get it. He's been doing this for 30 years. He went to San Quentin. He lived with the Westboro Baptist Church. And now he has to explain why he's interviewing a guy who got famous for screaming at girls on a podcast. It must feel like a degradation of the form.
However, we have to look at the audience. The people watching this on Netflix aren't the incels. They are the normies. They are the parents. There's a Reddit thread discussing the documentary where a user said the film missed the point because it focused on the influencers, not the why. Why are men so lonely? Why does this resonate? The documentary shows the symptom, the grifter, but not the disease.
That's the missing piece. Forbidden America touched on it slightly, the sense of white decline, the economic anxiety. But Inside the Manosphere is so focused on the spectacle of wealth that it forgets the poverty of spirit that drives the followers. We see the McLaren, but we don't see the kid in his bedroom sending his last $50 to Andrew Tate's Hustlers University or whatever copycat version Justin Waller is selling. Speaking of Tate, he's the ghost in the machine here, isn't he? He's not in the film directly, legal issues obviously, but his presence is everywhere. The cigar smoking, the sunglasses indoors, the way they talk. It shows how homogenous this rebellion is. They all think they're unique alphas, but they're all just doing Tate cosplay.
Cosplay is the perfect word, and Lewis is good at spotting actors. Remember, his first big hit was Weird Weekends, where he tried out for porn and wrestling. He understands performance. I think he views the Manosphere as a performance art piece that got out of hand. When he asks Sullivan if he really believes the stuff he says, and Sullivan just shrugs and says, "I don't give a fuck, I'm doing it for money," that's the reveal. It's kayfabe. It's wrestling. But the consequences are real.
So, final verdict on Inside the Manosphere? Essential viewing or a misstep?
I think it's essential, but with a warning label. It's not going to de-radicalize anyone deep in the sauce. If you love Sneeko, you'll watch this and think Sneeko owned Louis. But for the rest of us, it's a necessary map of a very dark territory. It shows us that the modern far right isn't just about boots and braces anymore. It's about drop shipping courses and podcast mics. It's banal, and that's what makes it scary.
I'm leaning towards misstep, but a fascinating one. I think Louis met his match, not intellectually, but structurally. The internet has created a feedback loop that even his legendary awkwardness can't disrupt. When the subjects are recording you back and monetizing your confusion, the documentary stops being a window and starts being a mirror, and I'm not sure I liked what I saw in the reflection. If you've watched it, I'm curious if you think Louis pierced the armor or just polished it. Send this episode to a friend who's obsessed with the Rue, or dare I say it, a friend who's falling down the Manosphere rabbit hole. It might spark the conversation they need to have.
Imagine this scenario. You're a filmmaker, a self-described feminist, and you decide to pick up a camera to expose a hate group. You go in expecting to find monsters, you expect to find the dark heart of misogyny, but then something strange happens. You stop arguing and you start listening. And by the time you put the camera down, the people who used to be your allies are petitioning to have your film banned, and the people you thought were monsters are calling you a hero. It sounds like a movie script, but it's actually the messy, complicated history of the most controversial documentary in the last decade of gender politics. We are talking, of course, about the Manosphere, the documentaries that try to explain it, and the ferocious backlash that seems to follow them from every single direction. I'm Chloe, and today we're asking, can you ever really film the enemy without becoming them?
It's a dangerous game, isn't it? You stare into the abyss, and the abyss sends you a DM asking for a collab.
Exactly. Joining me to break this down is media critic and digital culture historian Alex. Alex, it feels like every few years, or even every few months now, we get a new definitive documentary about the Manosphere. Whether it's the recent exposés on figures like Andrew Tate by Vice and the BBC, or the older, more indie films, the cycle is always the same. Outrage, clicks, and then a trench warfare of opinions. But why is this specific genre so radioactive?
Because it's not just a documentary genre, Chloe. It's a proxy war. When you point a camera at the Manosphere, which is this nebulous umbrella term for
men's rights activists, MRAs, pickup artists, MGTO, men going their own way, and incels, you aren't just filming a subculture. You are filming a group of people who believe they are in an existential struggle against modern society. So if the documentary is critical, the Manosphere calls it a hit piece and uses it as proof that the media hates men. If the documentary is sympathetic or even just neutral, the mainstream public calls it platforming hate speech and tries to deplatform it. There is almost no middle ground.
And I think we have to talk about the elephant in the room here, which is the 2016 documentary, The Red Pill. I know we're a few years out from it now, but in 2026, looking back, that film feels like patient zero for this entire both sides debate. It wasn't just a movie, it was a cultural event that people fought over in the streets.
Absolutely. If you want to understand the backlash dynamics of today, you have to understand The Red Pill and its director, Cassie Jaye. The story is fascinating because of who she was. Jaye was an established feminist filmmaker. She had made documentaries supporting gay marriage and sex education. She won awards. She decided to make a film about the men's rights movement, essentially to document what she thought was a hate group. She went in with this standard feminist critique. These men are angry, they are misogynists, and they want to roll back women's rights.
Right. And that's the documentary most people expected. But that's not the one she made. And that pivot is where the explosion happened.
Correct. Over the course of filming, Jaye started to feel that the media narrative around these men was incomplete. She interviewed figures like Paul Elam from A Voice for Men, who is undeniably a provocateur, but she also interviewed men who were talking about male suicide rates, workplace deaths, and the lack of support for male victims of domestic violence. By the end of the film, Jaye famously records a video diary where she says she can no longer call herself a feminist. She didn't become an MRA per se, but she adopted a position that looked a lot like, "We have been ignoring men's pain."
And that is where the wheels came off. I remember reading about the screenings in Australia. It wasn't just bad reviews, it was actual cancellations.
It was intense. In Melbourne, the Kino Cinema actually canceled a planned screening after a petition circulated calling the film misogynistic propaganda. The petition, which garnered thousands of signatures, argued that the film legitimized views that were dangerous to women. There were protests at the University of Sydney where police had to be present. The argument from the backlash, let's call this side A, the critics, was that by presenting these men as sympathetic victims, the film was effectively laundering their more toxic ideas. They argued that you can't just hand a microphone to someone like Paul Elam without rigorously fact-checking his more inflammatory statements.
To be fair to the critics, Paul Elam has said some truly vile things. I mean, he once wrote an article, he claims it was satire, about bashing a violent bitch, and he's made comments suggesting that women who go out drinking are begging for assault. When you have a figure like that as a central voice, isn't the criticism justified? Isn't listening to him just amplifying abuse?
That is the core of the ethical dilemma. Critics like Alan Scherstall from The Village Voice tore the film apart for that exact reason. He called it amateurish and argued that Jaye failed to push back. The critique was that she got love-bombed by the movement, that she was naive and let them spin a narrative where feminism is the villain. The Guardian review by Luke Buckmaster was similarly scathing, suggesting the film was less of a documentary and more of a conversion story that lacked critical distance. The fear was that a young man watching this would see Elam not as a radical, but as a reasonable truth-teller, because the filmmaker framed him that way.
Okay, so that's side A. The film is dangerous propaganda that platforms misogynists. But then you have side B, the supporters, who saw the backlash itself as proof of the film's thesis. Talk to me about that dynamic.
This is the Streisand effect of the manosphere. When the Kino Cinema canceled that screening, or when feminist groups protested, it fed directly into the manosphere's narrative that society doesn't care about men. They could point to the protests and say, see, we try to talk about male suicide, and they shut us down. They fear the truth. For the supporters, The Red Pill wasn't about Paul Elam's satire, it was about Earl Silverman.
Earl Silverman, that's the most heartbreaking part of the whole saga. Can you explain his story for listeners who haven't seen the doc?
Earl Silverman is the emotional anchor of the pro-film argument. He was a Canadian man who was a victim of domestic abuse by his wife. When he tried to find a shelter, there were none for men. So he spent years of his life and his own money trying to run the only dedicated shelter for male victims of domestic violence in Canada. He constantly applied for government funding and was constantly denied because the funding models were strictly for women's services. In the documentary, we learn that shortly before the film was released, Earl Silverman committed suicide. He felt he had failed. He couldn't keep the shelter open.
God, it's devastating, and it's a fact. It's a real thing that happened.
It is a fact. And for the supporters of the film, dismissing the red pill as just misogynistic propaganda means erasing Earl Silverman. They argue that the backlash proved that progressives only care about gender equality when it benefits women. To them, Cassie Jaye was a hero because she was the first outsider to look at a dead man like Earl Silverman and say, this is a systemic failure, rather than blaming it on toxic masculinity.
This is where the nuance gets really difficult because you can hold two thoughts in your head. Earl Silverman was failed by a system that lacks empathy for men, and Paul Elam is a toxic figure who radicalizes young men into hating women. But the documentary format and the discourse around it forces you to choose a team. You're either with the protesters or you're with the red pill.
Precisely. And that polarization has only gotten worse in the decades since. If you look at the modern landscape, what we see now with the coverage of influencers like Andrew Tate or the Fresh and Fit podcast, the documentary style has shifted. We've moved away from the Cassie Jaye style of empathetic listening. Modern docs like the Vice Investigations or the Channel 4 documentaries presented by journalists like Ben Zand are much more confrontational. They are exposés. They go in specifically to debunk the lies, to show the coercion, to show the financial scams behind the ideology.
But does that work? Or does it just create the same feedback loop? I feel like when Vice did their piece on Tate, his fans didn't say, oh, wow, he's a criminal. They said, look, the Matrix is attacking him.
You've hit on the key difference between 2016 and 2026. In 2016, the manosphere was desperate for validation. They wanted a mainstream filmmaker to say, you have a point. That's why they embraced the red pill. Today, the manosphere doesn't want validation. They want conflict. They need the backlash. Figures like Tate or the Fresh and Fit guys actively invite hit pieces because every time the BBC or Vice attacks them, their engagement numbers go up. They've weaponized the documentary format. If a journalist comes to interview them, they film the journalist filming them and then release their own uncut version to prove the media is lying. It's a hall of mirrors.
So where does that leave the audience? If the empathetic approach of the red pill leads to accusations of platforming hate, and the confrontational approach of modern docs just fuels the persecution complex, how do we actually talk about these issues? Is there a third way?
I think the lesson from the backlash to the red pill is that we have to separate the issues from the movement. The backlash failed when it tried to silence the discussion of male suicide or custody battles. That just drove men deeper into the radical groups. But the film failed, in the eyes of critics, by not adequately interrogating how those legitimate issues were being hijacked by misogynists. It's the difference between saying men are hurting and saying men are hurting because of women.
Exactly. The manosphere conflates those two things. A responsible documentary needs to validate the pain, the Earl Silvermans of the world, while ruthlessly dismantling the blame game that figures like Elam or Tate play. It's a very hard needle to thread. The red pill leaned too far into validating the blame game for many critics. The modern hit pieces lean too far into dismissing the pain for the supporters. The backlash is the sound of those two realities crashing into each other.
It's interesting you mentioned the funding aspect, too. I remember the red pill had trouble getting funding initially, right? That was another controversy.
Yes, and this is a crucial detail. Cassie Jaye initially tried to get traditional funding, but she says producers wanted a specific feminist-leaning angle. When she refused to guarantee that outcome, the money dried up. She turned to Kickstarter. And who donated? A significant chunk of the money came from the manosphere itself, including backing from A Voice for Men and figures like Mike Cernovich. Critics jumped on this immediately, calling it a conflict of interest. How can you be objective when the subjects of your film are paying for it?
That's a massive ethical red flag in journalism. You don't let the subject pay the writer.
It is. Jay defended it by saying she retained full creative control and that she disclosed the funding sources transparently. She argued that if mainstream sources wouldn't fund a balanced look, she had to take money where she could get it. But for the skeptics, this tainted the entire project. It allowed people to dismiss the film as paid propaganda before they even saw it. And yet for the supporters, the fact that only they would fund it was further proof that the system was rigged against them.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy on both sides. The critics say, it's funded by haters, so we won't watch it. The supporters say, you won't watch it because you hate the truth. And meanwhile, the actual issues, like the fact that we still don't have adequate mental health resources for men, get lost in the culture war.
And that is the tragedy of the manosphere documentary genre. It rarely changes minds. It just radicalizes the people already in the room. I think The Red Pill is a fascinating historical document. Not because it's a perfect film. It has flaws, it has pacing issues, it relies heavily on talking heads, but because it captured a moment where a liberal feminist woman said, "Wait a minute," and the resulting explosion fractured her entire career. She essentially lost her community in the film world, but gained a massive cult-like following online. It's a cautionary tale about the cost of crossing the aisle in a polarized era.
It really makes you wonder if a documentary like that could even be made today. The lines are so much harder now. If a feminist filmmaker today announced they were listening to incels, they'd be canceled before the first day of shooting.
Probably. And conversely, the manosphere has become so insular that they wouldn't trust a feminist filmmaker to enter their space at all. They have their own media ecosystem now. They don't need a Cassie J to tell their story. They have their own podcasts with millions of listeners. The bridge that Jay tried to build, however imperfectly, has effectively burned down.
So, looking at both sides, what's the verdict? Was the backlash against the red pill a necessary defense of women's safety, or was it a catastrophic tactical error that fueled the rise of the modern, more aggressive manosphere?
I'd argue it was a tactical error. Banning the film in Australia was the best PR the manosphere ever got. It turned a low-budget indie doc into forbidden knowledge. It allowed them to frame themselves as the punk rock rebels fighting censorship. If the critics had simply engaged with the film, critiqued the weak arguments, and agreed with the strong ones, like the need for male shelters, it might have diffused the anger. Instead, the total rejection confirmed the manosphere's darkest paranoia that society wants them silenced. And we are still living with the radioactive fallout of that confirmation today.
That is a sobering thought. We often think that fighting hate means shutting it down, but sometimes shutting it down just pressurizes the container until it explodes. Alex, this has been an incredibly illuminating look into a very dark corner of the internet.
Thank you, Chloe. It's a messy topic, but one we can't afford to ignore.
And thank you for listening. This is a topic that hits close to home for a lot of people, and I'm sure you have thoughts on whether these documentaries do more harm than good. If you found this conversation valuable or if it challenged you, send it to a friend who loves deep dives into internet culture. It's the best way to keep these conversations going.